Pinkie Pie and Big Mac's Baking Bonanza by TheOrangeFox. Hi, I'm Pinkie Pie, and today we're going to try baking frosted cupcakes. To help me, also I've brought one of the biggest helpers in Ponyville, Big Mac. The slow, bulky red stallion sat confused on the tiled floor as Pinkie Pie yet again managed to achieve one of her wall-breaking feats. Big Mac failed to see who she was talking to, but either way, Pinkie Pie decided to get started. Now, it's very important we're all prepared and ready first, Pinkie chirped, heading to the sink. Hooves have to be absolutely clean. She set the tap on, releasing a gush of cold water which she ran her hooves under. You too, Big Mac. He cocked his head to the side and got up slowly, heading for the sink. He remained mute as he washed his hooves before returning to the kitchen counter. Okie dokie loki. Now for the ingredients. Where did I put that flour? Pinkie began to clamber around in search of what she was looking for. After a few seconds she found most of the stuff, but was still missing the flour. It was then that she remembered the shelf she had put it on, and it was a high one. Pinkie stumbled over and picked up a stool before reaching for it. Big Mac continued to sit quietly like a clueless infant. His eyes explored around the room without much care. That was until he focused on Pinkie Pie, who was still reaching up high to grab the flour. She hadn't taken much consideration for her backside. In fact, she was completely exposed to him. Big Mac had little knowledge of girls. He'd been through the birds and the bees, but he hadn't expected right now to be actually observing a real mare's femininity. Pinkie's poofy tail was popped up high enough for him to see all, from the dark, thick outer ring of flesh to the slightly moist, bright pink opening staring him square in the face. Big Mac blushed and his pupils shrank. He remembered the last time he saw the pictures and how he sported an erection in class. The other stallions giggled immaturely, but not him, and his size didn't help much either. A bead of sweat rolled down his face. He managed to look away before he reacted, and distracted himself with other thoughts. It would have been easier had the image not mentally placed itself as top priority distraction in his mind. Pinkie managed to grab the flour eventually, setting it on the counter. Finally, we can start, she said, gathering the rest of the equipment. She skipped along past Big Mac, who was holding an icing bag in his mouth. Oh, we'll need that later to ice the cupcakes, Pinkie chirped, taking it from him. See? It works like this. You pour the mixture in, and it comes out the funnel here. She demonstrated by squeezing a drop on the counter before licking it up with her tongue. Tasty, she beamed, licking her lips as Big Mac had a try. He picked it up in his mouth and gently squeezed down, but it produced nothing. He frowned and placed it on the counter. He moved his head close to it, wondering if it was blocked. Big Mac then slammed his hoof on the bag, but he didn't expect to get strawberry icing all over his face. Pinkie giggled at the mess he'd made. He decided to copy what she did. He ran his tongue around his face as far as he could, but unlike Pinkie, his tongue couldn't reach that far. He always wondered how she managed to do what would be considered something beyond a pony's limits. Mac cleaned the rest of his face, but Pinkie was still giggling. Missed some, she chuckled, leaning close to lick it off his cheek. A Big Mac cake with strawberry icing, Pinkie giggled, but Big Mac was blushing. She had merely licked him inches away from his lips, plus the warmth he had felt was something new to him, and he liked it. Looky, I have a mustache, Pinkie giggled, having drawn a line of icing across her top lip. She continued chuckling, but then Big Mac leaned and licked her back. The two of them sat in awkward silence for a while. Slowly and surely Big Mac began to regret what he had done. He couldn't, however, evade Pinkie's gaze. To him she seemed more beautiful now, and Pinkie could tell what he was thinking. Her flat-lined mouth soon turned to a slight smile. Mac wasn't the only one who liked being licked like that. Pinkie's eyelids lowered as she leaned closer to him. He could smell the icing on her as she came closer and briefly kissed him on the lips. She looked back and smiled as Big Mac blushed some more. Cooking can be fun, Pinkie spoke in a sultry, happy tone, as ideas popped into her head. Oh, wait, you've got more icing on you, silly. She leaned close again, and this time licked his pursed lips slowly, cleaning the icing off. She continued to kiss him after that, and Big Mac could feel her tongue sliding between the ridge of his sealed lips. It felt like it was trying to push its way in, so Big Mac let his jaw go loose. Pinkie leaned further against him, He was like a warm, cuddly, fuzzy bear. Her lips stroked against his as she looked deeper into his eyes with her bright blue sensual gaze. This was one of her playing around with the boys moments. Big Mac himself was completely mind-blown. Of course, he wasn't sure how to kiss her back, but he could feel the warmth of her tongue pressing up around against his. "Use your tongue, Big Mac. Here." She picked up the icing before placing a dot of it on the tip of her tongue. "Give it a taste," she chirped, sticking her tongue out before him. Mac moved his head a little and slowly licked the spot where the icing was. Now it tasted twice as good. Pinkie kissed him harder, sliding her tongue around his. Mac was starting to get the hang of it, just about. They made a mess of saliva on their lips as they continued to taste each other rather than the icing. Pinkie loved the thickness of his tongue on hers. It wasn't like other stallions. She for once felt herself being dominated by the kiss, rather than spiraling out of control on others, and she could only begin to imagine how Big Mac was down there. The thought of his stallionhood made her nethers tingle with excitement. She felt juices seeping from her opening, going down her legs. "Hey, Mac, want to try something else?" she asked briefly after pulling off him. He watched her as she picked up a can of flavored whipped cream and lay down on her back. She held the nozzle between her legs and it came foaming out over her nethers. The coldness stimulated her clit a little, but she was used to it. This wasn't the first time Pinkie had done this. "Come over, try it," Pinkie beamed, inviting him over. Big Mac slowly moved closer and looked between her hind legs. The white substance covered over her nethers, and to him it looked slightly inviting. Pinkie watched his head as he lowered his snout between her legs. In one big sweep he lapped most of the cream from her. Pinkie gasped a little, just about feeling his tongue sliding over her puffy dark pink lips. Mac went in for another taste, and already he was loving it. He continued to lick up and down around her slit until he had cleared all of the cream. He was still licking her there, now tasting her juices as they seeped between her vaginal opening. Pinkie sighed sexually, trying to tame her body as she reacted to the powerful stimulations. He noticed how happy she sounded, so he continued to taste her wet flesh. It was only a matter of time before Pinkie felt her clit throbbing, desperate to be felt by that big rough tongue. Her pink coat was turning shiny from the sweat she was producing, and Mac could feel the intense heat from between her legs. It made him feel more aroused as he explored her further with his tongue. Pinkie was still itching to feel it, his thick meat slide near her bud, but it didn't touch it. She mentally wished for him to go further up. By now her legs had locked around his head, and she was stroking his face whilst moaning and giggling. "Want to taste my cherry?" Pinkie chuckled. Mac retracted his head, looking a little confused, but then she parted her hind legs and spread her pussy lips open with her hooves. "Right here," she chirped, as Mac resumed eating her out. His tongue loomed over her flesh, going ever higher and higher. Pinkie began to sweat nervously as she felt it coming. It was like a time bomb waiting to go off. Just a little... Pinkie gasped before giggling heavily. She finally felt his tongue sliding over her throbbing clit, and what a sensation it was. Mac was now doing it repeatedly, and Pinkie Pie was trying her hardest to control herself. It tickles," she giggled as her body thrashed about while Mac continued to sample her cherry, as she called it. By now his snout was covered in her juices, but she just wouldn't stop. Mac slowly pushed his tongue further against her bud, rubbing it back and forth, feeling her squirm and giggle loudly. She continued to laugh, getting louder and louder, until Mac's face was covered in her juices as she squirted all over him. "Now it's my turn to try something," she spoke, getting up. She instructed Big Mac to sit and lean against the counter with his legs apart. Pinkie Pie came closer and was staring at his sheath, making him blush. "I wonder how this tastes," she asked, moving her head between his legs. Mac watched her as her mouth neared the opening. She stuck her tongue in, and immediately his eyes went wide. Pinkie's tongue rolled around the soft head. She tasted his pre-cum and continued to taste his member out of hiding. Mac began to feel stimulated, and already it was starting to grow. She continued licking the tip, feeling it getting thicker by the second. The head emerged from the shaft and began to rise up straight at an alarming rate. "Ooh, look at it go," Pinkie observed as it continued to get bigger and bigger. He wasn't called Big Mac for nothing. It was ridiculously big. She was beginning to wonder if it would fit in her mouth, just the tip even. Big Mac was fully exposed to her, and she continued to gaze at his proud flagpole. Now let's see," Pinkie smiled. "Step 1. Preheat the oven. Well, we've already done that," she beamed, still feeling the heat between her flanks. "Step 2. She began rubbing his bulging mass. "Prepare ingredients." Mac curiously watched as she slid her tongue all the way up his length and back down again. She repeated it a few times, getting it wet before slowly popping it into her mouth. Pinkie had underestimated it. It was huge. She could barely get her lips around the thing, let alone suck on it. Either way, she fiddled about before sliding the tip just about in her mouth. It was the biggest stallion cock she'd ever taken so far. Pinkie went down as far as she could, but she could only muster a few inches. Either way, she began to suckle on what little she could manage. Mac grunted a little, feeling her tongue circling around his tip. He liked the tingly sensation it gave him, as well as the arousing feeling in his body. He continued to watch Pinkie Pie, growing more fond of and attracted to her. Pinkie, on the other hand, was trying her best to manage his engorged meat. Each time she slid down on it, she could feel it throbbing hard as her tongue traced over the thick veins. The more she sucked him off, the more aroused she felt about wondering how it would feel inside her. His tip rubbed against her petite tongue as her lips danced up and down it, whilst her cheeks sucked in and out. Pinkie looked up at Mac and smiled. He had no idea how she managed to do such a thing with that in her mouth, but she done it. It slipped from her lips, and she took a breath before licking it again and continuing the blowjob. Pinkie used her hooves to further stimulate him. She rubbed it hard between them, feeling it pulsing slowly. She stopped to lick him again and went further down. Her nose rubbed against it as she took one of his huge balls in her mouth. She gently pressed her tongue against it, wondering how Mac would feel. He didn't seem to react much as it slowly popped out of her mouth. She resumed licking him again, which made him flinch. From all the wetness and sucking, Mac could feel his groin ache. He grunted a little as Pinkie went faster, and aided in his pleasure with his hooves. She could see him smiling now, and progressed further as his overwhelming cock began to throb hard. "Ooh, it's almost done," Pinkie squealed as she resumed sucking him off harder. Mac squeezed his eyes shut as Pinkie masturbated him. She leaned back with a bowl between her legs and jerked him harder, watching his face contort and twist. She carried on, going at an insane speed until Big Mac's body started rocking back and forth, and he unleashed a torrent of cum all over her face. Pinkie giggled like crazy as he spunked all over her. Some of it was in the bowl, and most was on her face. She should have expected such a big load from such a big stallion. She finished milking him and tasted his cum all over her face. Juicy," she chirped with a big grin as she cleaned herself off and put the bowl aside. "Now, step 3, she began, ready to hit off again. Mac was still wheezing from his previous orgasm, but now Pinkie was rearing to go. "Now we have to... mix the ingredients," she gasped as she began rubbing her wet slit around his still hard member. Big Mac became aroused from the sensations of her wet flesh, getting him slick. The feeling helped him to maintain his erection as Pinkie lubed him up with her juices. The room became hot within a short instant, as the two ponies in heat got more into the mood. Mac was a little nervous, but now he really wanted this. He was loving Pinkie Pie, enjoying her down to the last detail. "Now we mix it up," Pinkie spoke with a slightly suggestive hint of sultriness in her tone of voice. She rubbed her opening around his tip, making it nice and slick before she slowly went down on him. Pinkie felt his massiveness invading her narrow nethers. His penis spread her apart as it became enveloped between her walls. She rested her hooves on him for support as he continued to groan from the wet, slimy feeling around his hardness. Pinkie playfully looked into his eyes, feeling naughty as she engaged in sex with him. She went down further until about an inch of his red rod was left exposed between her puffy, fleshy opening. Pinkie slowly rode up on his chest, feeling herself grind against his powerful body. She went up as high as she could stand before sliding down on him again. Mac was in heaven. For the first time he was experiencing a mare sexually. Pinkie's feminist felt extremely tight and soaking wet. He watched as fluids leaked from her spread lips, running down his slick, throbbing pony cock. Pinkie got into rhythm and began riding him slowly so as not to spear herself on his immense size. She thought it would feel more narrow at the base, but the entire length was wide from tip to bottom, and his flared head spread her lips apart almost instantly. Pinkie blushed and smiled as she continued to ride him. She loved Big Mac. He was cute the way he sat and smiled with her as they enjoyed each other. His throbbing hardness continued to radiate heat inside her, adding degrees to her already baking hot oven. She continued bouncing up and down on him, locking her legs around his waist as she snuggled with him. The sounds of wet flesh rubbing on his flesh filled the room as Pinkie cheerfully rode hard on his stallionhood. It was so big she could feel her nethers aching from the strain. She wondered if she'd retain her tightness after this. No other stallion had managed to spread her so far apart before. Pinkie's breaths became shorter. She giggled and nuzzled Big Mac's snout before kissing him again. Her juices were making a mess of his crotch. Their saliva was all over their mouths as they continued the slow, sensual, heated intercourse between each other. "Ooh, Big Mac, you have a big stirrer. It's really mixing it up." Pinkie bobbed up and down on him a little faster. More fluids coated his slick mass as her feminineness rubbed and caressed his bulging member. He groaned a little, clenching his jaws as the pleasure blew him over. Pinkie was going a little faster now, having adjusted to the feeling of his thickness spreading her insides. He hugged her and rubbed her nose again. He just loved kissing her and feeling her tongue around his. This was the most he had smiled all day. Pinkie continued to gasp as her breaths became even shorter. "Let's mix it all up good now." Pinkie started to speed up again. Her insides oozed juices, enveloping his hot maleness in her warm, juicy flesh. She was breathing hard on his face, gasping with her mouth hanging open. His meat throbbing harder inside her, pulsing as his cum bubbled up in his balls below. Pinkie squashed her snout against his. She leaned further into him as her hips worked wonders over his cock. She felt it pulsing hard, ready to explode again. "Now we had the cream," she squealed, squeezing her feminineness tight, pumping his shaft hard until he came again. Big Mac growled and released a jet stream of cum in her pink, hot pussy. She groaned a little, feeling it throb as the hot, gooey substance creamed her snatch. It filled her nethers, and his cream spilled on the floor, running down between their sexes. Pinkie squeezed it inside her again before slowly sliding off. A huge blob of cum slapped on the floor, forming a puddle as she caught her breath back, as well as Big Mac. They kissed again before she got back up and looked at the counter. Half her mind was drunk on sex, the other half focused on the half-done cupcake mixture. Her legs wobbled as she moved the bowl over to the cupcake tin. "Okay, step 4, pour the mixture." Pinkie Pie tried to concentrate as she filled each section. Big Mac, on the other hand, was preoccupied with staring at her ass. He had already had a good, beautiful view of her front, but now he was watching her behind moving about as she got to pouring. Pinkie had a well-rounded, plump posterior. Mostly the cupcakes and sweets were responsible, but they paid off for sure. Big Mac began to follow his animal instincts as he neared Pinkie Pie. He felt it getting hard again, still slick from her thick, messy juices. Without warning, he reared up and came closer before resting his hooves on the counter as he tried to find her. The horny red stallion continued to rub his member between her butt while looking for an opening. "Big Mac, don't be silly," Pinkie giggled. "I need to pour it first." But she continued to chuckle, feeling the head of his swollen bulk protruding up between her ass. "Here," she said, keeping still and allowing him to find her. He felt the head against her wet flesh hole, and whilst grinning, he pushed forward, feeling it slide in her again. Big Mac squeezed it further inside her, feeling the sensation of her narrow, wet insides engulfing around it. It continued to travel up to her womb where it could go no further. Again that inch was left in the open, but he didn't mind. The tip was the most sensitive part, and he felt the warmth as it rested snug between her tight feminines. Pinkie tried to continue pouring, but only made a mess as Mac began thrusting her slowly. She became distracted by the feeling of his thick rod slowly easing in and out of her passage. Big Mac inserted it again, wishing to feel her soft, bubbly butt against his body. Pinkie sighed a little as he continued to pound her body slowly. Her juices dripped all over his cock, making more of a mess on the floor. She poured into another section, but was thrown off course as Big Mac thrust in a little harder. The mixture spilt over the tin, but Pinkie could barely care less. Instead, she rested her own hooves on the counter and tried to pour it with her mouth. She started off, but his heavy body pressed down on her, making her spill more. "Mac, you're making a mess," Pinkie giggled as he grunted again. Sweat dripped off his matted coat and onto hers. The scent of sex overpowered their senses, and now he was thrusting harder. Mac tried to get it all in, but he was too big for her. He reared up and was now resting his hooves on her back. Pinkie groaned slightly, feeling it throbbing again. She wondered just how much of a load he had in there. Just one more to fill," she gasped, beginning to pour. She was almost done, but her body jerked as her clit reacted to his powerful thrusting. She spilt more, making a mess of the tray, but they were all done. Big Mac was enjoying himself a little too much. He let his thickness slide out up to the tip before driving it back home, making Pinkie squeak. "Mac, can I put it in the oven now?" Pinkie gasped. The strong red stallion listened and dismounted her. His shaft slipped out, dripping with her juices as it swung like a pendulum. "Step 5. Now we bake," Pinkie huffed as she carefully opened the oven. "Remember, ovens are very dangerous," she breathed as she slid the tray in and closed the oven door, setting the timer. "And now we get to bake." Pinkie smiled, turning to Big Mac and laying on her back. She spread her hind legs out and beckoned him with her tail. He happily came closer, positioning himself between her legs as he brought his thick stallionhood closer to her slit. Pinkie held on to him as he found her and penetrated her slowly. The warm, loving feeling of her silky, tight haven caressing his member returned to him as they resumed having sex on the floor. Pinkie Pie rubbed his sides as he bucked his hips back and forth into her soft body. He continued to smile, feeling her wet flesh sucking his length deeper between her walls. They looked into each other's eyes lovingly, kissing again as Mac made sweet love to her. He could feel the tight ring of her opening squeezing around his tip as it slid back and forth, rubbing up her insides. Pinkie's face flushed red again as she began panting and smiling her biggest smile. She loved how Big Mac felt inside her, and she held him closer in her forelegs, snuggling him. Big Mac rested his forehooves on either side of her as he continued thrusting his pulsating maleness deep inside her warm, wet snatch. Pinkie could feel her sensitive clit tingling with sensation as Big Mac's hot meat continued to rub it up and down, making her more excited. His slick length parted her insides further, making her feel the force of it pumping in and out, getting slightly faster. The oven only added to the heat of the room. Their bodies grinded against each other as their orgasms reached ever closer. Almost done," Pinkie gasped, but Big Mac wasn't sure if she was talking about herself or the cupcakes. Either way, he penetrated her faster, enjoying the sensation of the tension building up in his crotch, his red lubed member continuing to slide between her tight, wet opening. She felt it throbbing hard and held on to him tightly, trying to snuggle with him. "Oh, Mac, ready to frost the cake?" Pinkie giggled as her face dripped with sweat. "Yep," Mac replied, nodding his head. The tip of her poofy mane continued to bob up and down as their bodies rocked back and forth. By now, Mac felt completely stimulated. The tension reached bursting point as he gave the last few thrusts he could. Pinkie could feel her crevice getting tighter as her clit continued to receive pleasure from his organ. She moaned and held his sides tightly as Big Mac's penis began to twitch vigorously. "I'ma frost the cake," he smiled dumbfoundedly, as at once he felt the warm, wet release of cum shooting out of his cock as his muscles went into spasm. He howled loudly with pleasure as Pinkie came also. She squirted all over his member as it milked him hard of his seed. Her feminist trapped it inside, as she became full of cum, spilling it on the floor. Their eyes rolled to the back of their skulls as the pleasuring contractions rocked their bodies. Mac gave one last push before his orgasm subsided. He was careful not to collapse on Pinkie Pie so suddenly. The energy drained from his muscles. He slowly lowered himself onto her. They kissed each other momentarily until they both heard the loud beep-beep of the oven. "Cupcakes are done!" Pinkie Pie cheered. Big Mac let her get up, and she went to the oven to take the cupcakes out. His seed spilled to the floor from her well-creamed femness. She rested the cupcakes on a cooling rack and picked up the frosting bag, but it was empty. "Now what?" Big Mac asked slowly. Pinkie Pie sided next to him, kissing his cheek. "Want to make more frosting?" she giggled, looking playfully into his eyes. "Yup," he replied slyly, giggling also. "Good. Step 6. Frost and enjoy." She laughed, taking Big Mac in her arms and pulling him to the messy kitchen floor. "Oh, and thanks for reading on how to make cupcakes," she added with another giggle.